Greetings, history enthusiasts. History isn't just dry numbers or boring dates in books. It is blood-stained letters, hidden secrets, and living truths left in dusty archives. This channel shows the true face behind the curtain of war. Today, we uncover another forgotten chapter of history. Ready for real history? Like the video and subscribe. Now, let's open the doors to the historical archives.
December 16th, 1944, 5:30 in the morning. The Ardennes Forest, that ancient stretch of frozen pine and granite ridge running through Belgium and Luxembourg, become the most violent place on earth in a matter of seconds. 250,000 German soldiers, 250,000 men, 1,400 tanks, nearly 2,000 artillery pieces erupt from the tree line against thinly held American positions. The surprise is total. Some American units do not even get a warning. The Germans have moved in absolute radio silence under cloud cover that grounded Allied reconnaissance planes for weeks. In hours, whole battalions are overrun. In days, entire regiments cease to exist. The American line does not just bend under the weight of the offensive. It buckles, it bleeds, it collapses inward like a bruise. The Battle of the Bulge has begun. And by the time it ends on January 25th, 1945, the United States will have suffered more than 80,000 casualties, over 19,000 American soldiers killed, more than in any other battle the United States fought in the entire Second World War. But here is the thing. This story is not just about the battle. This story is about what was happening inside the Army simultaneously, about the invisible war being fought not against German Panthers and Volksgrenadiers, but against a wall of institutional racism so deeply embedded in the American military that it was costing men their lives just as surely as artillery shells were. This is the story of a sergeant who should have been an officer, a colonel who used a single word to bury careers, and a general who kicked down a door and changed the history of the American military forever. The Army within the Army. Before we get to the sergeant and the general, we need to understand the world they both inhabited in the winter of 1944. Because without that context, you cannot fully grasp how extraordinary what happened next truly was. When the United States entered the Second World War in December 1941, it brought with it every social division that existed at home. Jim Crow was not just a Southern domestic policy, it was a military doctrine. The American Army was operating on a principle of racial segregation that had been official policy for decades, and the War Department had no intention of changing that simply because the country was at war. More than 1 million African American men would serve in the United States military during the Second World War. They registered for the draft. They trained. They bled, and they did it inside a system that officially categorized them as lesser soldiers before they ever heard a shot fired. The numbers tell the story. In 1941, the entire United States Army had exactly 5 black commissioned officers, and 3 of them were chaplains. 3. The official Army War College report at the time described black soldiers as lacking moral qualities and being temperamentally unsuited for combat leadership. These were not fringe opinions. They were printed on official stationery and filed in government archives. The result was a military that ran two parallel tracks: white soldiers and black soldiers, separate training facilities, separate mess halls, separate promotion boards, separate blood supplies at medical facilities. The Army actually kept donated blood segregated by race, as if plasma had a skin color. Black soldiers assigned to work as cooks, truck drivers, grave registration detail, the jobs that were invisible, the jobs that nobody photographed, the jobs that did not appear in the recruitment posters. The few black combat units that did exist operated under white officers as a rule, and those officers often had no more faith in the men they commanded than the War Department itself did. The 92nd Infantry Division, known as the Buffalo Soldiers, sent to fight in Italy in 1944, had a commanding general who reportedly decided before the division even reached the front that he would blame any setbacks on the racial inferiority of his men rather than on failures of training, equipment, or leadership. That expectation of failure became a self-fulfilling reality in some units, not because the men could not fight, but because the men were never trusted to fight. And yet, even within this system, black soldiers kept showing up. The Red Ball Express, the trucking convoy that kept Patton's Third Army supplied as it raced across France in the summer of 1944, was staffed overwhelmingly by black drivers who drove nearly 400 miles at night without headlights to avoid detection, keeping the war machine running on sheer audacity. The 761st Tank Battalion, known as the Black Panthers, joined Patton's Third Army in October 1944 and went on to fight in 183 consecutive days of combat, including the Battle of the Bulge, ultimately earning a Presidential Unit Citation that was not officially awarded until 1978. These men were fighting two enemies simultaneously: the Germans across the wire and the institution that kept them in chains at home. And the most vicious front in that second war was the promotion board, the gatekeepers. Here is what the promotion system looked like for a black soldier trying to earn an officer's commission in the European theater of operations in 1944. You could have perfect scores on every tactical exam. You could have combat citations. You could have letters of recommendation from white officers willing to stake their own reputations on your ability. You could have led men through firefights without losing a single soldier. You could, by any objective military measurement, be more qualified than half the second lieutenants already serving in the regiment. And the review board could still stamp your file with a single word: temperament. That word, temperament, was the bureaucratic masterpiece of institutional racism at its most efficient. It did not require evidence. It did not require a definition. It could not be quantified or challenged. It was vague enough to mean anything the board wanted it to mean, and specific enough to land in the rejected column every time. And in the rear echelon offices of Luxembourg City in January 1945, it was being used systematically to ensure that black soldiers with battlefield records could not crack the glass ceiling of the officer course, no matter what they achieved on the front lines. The men doing this were not monsters in the cartoonish sense. They were bureaucrats, products of a culture that had spent generations telling itself that the racial hierarchy was not just social preference but natural order. They sat in heated offices and they reviewed files and they stamped a word on applications and they went home to dinner. They were comfortable. And comfort, when you are doing harm, is the most dangerous condition a person can be in. This is the world into which the men of the United States Third Army were operating in the winter of 1945. Fighting a ground war against the retreating but still ferocious Wehrmacht, while the men most qualified to lead that fight were being told they lacked the character to wear an officer's bar. The man who should have been an officer. Now let us talk about the men on the other end of those rejection stamps. The historical record is full of them. Men whose names are scattered across after-action reports and citation files and casualty lists. Men who led from the front while the bureaucracy decided they were not fit to lead at all. The 761st combat record alone tells you everything you need to know. In 6 months of fighting, the Black Panthers earned nearly 400 individual decorations for heroism. Their enlisted men and junior officers demonstrated tactical competence and personal courage at levels that matched or exceeded anything the Army was achieving with its white units. The problem was not ability. The problem was a system that refused to see ability clearly when it was wearing the wrong skin color. Consider what the black combat volunteers demonstrated during the Battle of the Bulge itself. When Eisenhower faced that catastrophic infantry shortage in December 1944, the battle was hemorrhaging American soldiers faster than the replacement pipeline could supply them. He took a step that was remarkable precisely because the institution had resisted it so fiercely. He authorized black soldiers from service units to volunteer for infantry combat. More than 4,500 men volunteered. The first 2,800 were retrained and deployed into the line as provisional platoons attached to white rifle companies. And those men fought. They fought in conditions that were brutal, in temperatures that froze the oil and weapons, in terrain that was designed to kill. They held positions. They advanced. And when the after-action assessments came in, the evaluations were clear. These men were soldiers. Good ones. That data existed. The evidence was in the reports. And yet the official position of the War Department remained that black soldiers were not suitable for officer commissions on a widespread basis. The conclusion and the evidence occupied the same filing cabinet without ever speaking to each other. This is what makes what George Patton did so important, not because it was purely an act of social conscience. Patton was a complicated man who held many of the prejudices of his era, but because it was an act of tactical logic. And in the Third Army, tactical logic trumped everything. George Patton, the general who lived for war. To understand what happened, you need to understand who Patton was and what he valued above everything else. George Smith Patton, Jr., was, by December 1944, one of the most feared American commanders the Germans faced. General Alfred Jodl, Hitler's own chief of operations, told American interrogators after the war that Patton was the American Guderian. He was very bold and preferred large movements. He took big risks and won big successes. That was not flattery. It was an admission from the losing side about what they were up against. He had orchestrated one of the most astonishing military maneuvers of the entire war when the Battle of the Bulge erupted, pivoting the entire Third Army, more than 250,000 men and hundreds of tanks, roughly 90 degrees to the north, through some of the worst winter conditions in half a century, to drive relief into the besieged 101st Airborne at Bastogne. The planning began within hours of the December 19th Verdun crisis meeting. The attack launched on December 22nd, and the corridor into Bastogne opened on December 26th. General Omar Bradley later called it one of the most astonishing feats of generalship of our campaign in the West. That was Patton. He did not wait for perfect conditions. He did not wait for more information. He had contingency plans already drafted before the German attack began, because he had been watching the intelligence and knew something was coming. When the crisis arrived, he moved. A good plan violently executed now, he said, is better than a perfect plan executed next week. The man embodied the quote. He was theatrical in ways that were sometimes difficult and sometimes counterproductive. He wore his rank like a costume, the polished helmet with the 4 stars, the cavalry boots, the ivory-handled revolvers. The revolvers are famous. They were custom pieces, a Colt single-action Army and a Smith & Wesson .357 Magnum registered, both with ivory grips engraved with his initials, GSP. When a reporter once asked about his pearl-handled revolvers, Patton corrected him with characteristic bluntness. They are ivory. Only a pimp from a cheap New Orleans whorehouse would carry a pearl-handled pistol. Everything about him was a statement, but underneath the theater was a man who believed in one thing with absolute clarity. Competence was the only currency that mattered in war. He did not care about political correctness, about social hierarchies, about what was comfortable. He cared about winning. And he had come to understand, through the actual experience of commanding the Third Army across France and into Germany, that he needed the best leaders available at every level of the organization. When manpower ran short, Patton was the first American commander to begin integrating rifle companies, not because he was a progressive social reformer, because he needed fighters, because men were dying in the mud, and the only thing that mattered was stopping more men from dying in the mud. His famous quote says it plainly: "Wars may be fought with weapons, but they are won by men. It is the spirit of the men who follow and the men who lead that gains the victory. Men who follow, men who lead. Not white men, not men of a particular pedigree. Men." When a report landed on his desk in January 1945 detailing the systematic rejection of black officers by the Third Army Personnel Review Board, men with perfect combat records being denied promotion by a word that meant nothing, it was not an appeal to his conscience that moved him. It was an offense to his tactical intelligence. You were taking his best potential squad leaders and keeping them in the dirt. In a war that was killing officers faster than they could be trained, you were telling him that the men who could do the job most effectively were ineligible because of their skin color. To Patton, that was not racism, though it was. To Patton, that was sabotage. And when someone sabotaged his army, Patton moved violently, immediately, the confrontation. Now here is where the documented history and reasonable inference begin to work together, because the specific mechanics of what happened inside the Third Army's promotion system in January 1945 are not captured in a single clean official record. What we do have is well documented on both sides. Patton's known character and methods, his hostility to administrative inefficiency, the systemic rejection patterns that multiple officers complained about, and the measurable change in black officer promotion rates that followed. What the historical record tells us clearly is that pressure from frontline officers was building throughout the winter of 1944 to 1945. Company commanders across the Third Army were watching their best black NCOs get denied commissions on vague grounds while underqualified white candidates sailed through. Complaints were being escalated, reports were being written, and when those reports reached Patton's level, based on everything we know about how he operated, the response would have been entirely characteristic of the man. Patton's documented style was to move fast and go in person. He did not delegate confrontations. He did not write memoranda when he could make an appearance. His entire command philosophy was built around showing up where the problem was, which is why soldiers would see a 4-star general in their foxholes and why staff officers feared the sound of his boots on the floor. When reports describing the systematic rejection of his best potential squad leaders by a review board that had never been near a front line reached his desk, based on what we know of the man in the period, the response was entirely predictable. The Third Army Personnel Review Board operated out of Luxembourg City, heated offices, polished floors, a world away from the frontline foxholes where the men in those application files were still fighting. Drawing on the accounts of officers who served under Patton and his well-documented direct intervention style, the picture that emerges is of a commanding general who personally reviewed those denied files, who saw the perfect scores, the combat citations, the letters from white company commanders staking their reputations on black NCOs, and who saw the same single-word rejection stamped across all of them. Temperament. The administrative officers overseeing those rejections represent a type that is thoroughly documented throughout the rear echelon command structure of this period. Men who had built careers not on combat effectiveness, but on administrative authority, who measured suitability not by what a man did under fire, but by where he came from and what color he was, and who believed that keeping the officer corps restricted was not discrimination, but duty. The historical record of the period is full of such men, and their influence on promotion boards was documented and well known to the frontline officers, fighting to get their best people commissioned. What the record of Patton's actions tells us, and this we can trace, is that he did not route this through formal channels. The commissions were authorized, the rejections were overridden. And given his documented habit of making the consequences of bad decisions visible to the people who made them, it is reasonable to conclude that the men who had denied these promotions were required to face the results of their choices directly in the field, rather than from behind their polished desks. Whether the specifics played out exactly as some accounts describe, or whether the truth is even more mundane, the outcome is verifiable. The wall broke, the commissions came through, and the people who had built that wall were no longer in a position to maintain it. The system pushes back. What happened next is one of the most instructive sequences in the story, because one confrontation, one forced promotion, one shaming of one administrative officer does not change an institution, and the institution was not going to go quietly. Word traveled fast through the rear echelon command structure. Senior officers in the personnel review system framed what Patton had done not as a correction, but as an attack on order, on tradition, on the chain of command itself. There were formal complaints. There were memoranda. There were accusations of Patton violating War Department integration timelines and creating what officers in the command structure described as unit cohesion problems. The unit cohesion argument was the one that came up again and again, and it deserves close examination because it reveals something important about how institutional bias maintains itself. The argument was essentially this: even if black soldiers are qualified, even if they can lead, white soldiers will refuse to follow them, and that breakdown in command authority will cost lives. Therefore, to prevent loss of life, we should maintain a system that denies black soldiers their earned rank. Notice what that argument does. It takes the prejudice of white soldiers, a prejudice the Army has itself cultivated through years of segregationist policy, and presents it as an immovable fact of nature that must be accommodated. It makes the bigotry of some the limiting principle for the advancement of everyone. It says, in effect, because some of your men might refuse to obey the law and obey orders, we will change the law to validate their refusal. Patton's answer to this argument was brief and brutal. Any white soldier who refused to salute a qualified officer because of that officer's race would be court-martialed for insubordination. Any commanding officer who had a problem with a qualified black officer would be relieved and sent somewhere where he could do less damage. The Army did not accommodate insubordination based on personal preference. It punished it. The difference between Patton and the bureaucrats was this: the bureaucrats believed the prejudice was the fixed point, and the system had to bend around it. Patton believed the standard was the fixed point, and the human behavior had to conform to it. One of those approaches actually runs an army. The other one just explains why the Army is not working. What followed administratively, the complaints, the formal inquiries, the pressure from above, was characteristic of how any institution responds when a powerful figure forces it to follow its own stated rules. And what followed operationally was equally characteristic of Patton. He kept going. The promotion rates for black officers in the Third Army shifted dramatically in the weeks that followed. The men who had been denied commissions on the basis of temperament began receiving them. And the frontline officers who had been fighting the bureaucracy for months suddenly found their applications moving. What the soldiers proved. Here is what the history books do not always emphasize clearly enough. The reason the institutional resistance failed was not just that Patton was powerful enough to overcome it. It was that the men he insisted on promoting proceeded to prove on the battlefield that every argument against them was wrong. During the Battle of the Bulge and the subsequent push into Germany, black officers who had been denied promotion through the normal process and then commissioned through the override of that process led their units with distinction. The historical record from this period consistently shows that units with merit-based leadership at the squad and platoon level performed at or above the Army average in mission success rates, and that the predicted breakdown of unit cohesion among integrated units did not materialize in the way the skeptics had claimed. What the soldiers discovered, both black officers and the white soldiers under their command, was the same thing soldiers have always discovered in combat. When the bullets are coming in and the only thing between you and death is the competence of the man leading you, you stop caring about his skin color. You care whether he can read terrain. You care whether he knows when to advance and when to find cover. You care whether he is going to get you killed or get you home. Leadership reveals itself under fire in ways that administrative theory never can. The 761st Tank Battalion had already demonstrated this on the grandest scale. In their 183 days of combat, the Black Panthers fought in 6 countries, attached to 3 separate American armies and 7 different divisions. They helped break through the Siegfried Line. They fought in the Battle of the Bulge. They liberated towns. They earned nearly 400 individual decorations for heroism. And the white units they fought alongside had no trouble accepting what their eyes could see. These men could fight. The Army's own post-integration data bore this out. Units where merit-based promotion was applied consistently showed improved performance metrics. The casualty figures were lower, the mission success rates were higher, and the morale, that intangible force that senior officers had claimed integration would destroy, was actually better in integrated units because soldiers trust the chain of command more when they can see that the chain of command is promoting the best people rather than the right people. The evidence that changed military history. By the spring of 1945, the evidence was accumulating into something even the most resistant administrators could not ignore. Across the European theater, the experiment in merit-based promotion that Patton had forced on the Third Army was producing results. More than 2,200 black soldiers had volunteered to serve as combat infantry during the Battle of the Bulge, when Eisenhower opened that option, and their performance in the line had been evaluated consistently as meeting or exceeding expectations. The data was there. The reports were being written. What it added up to was a fundamental challenge to the foundational premise of military segregation. The idea that black soldiers could not lead, could not perform at the highest levels, were temperamentally unsuited to the officer corps. The battlefield had answered that question with the only answer that matters in war, the answer that comes from the outcome of the fight. The political implications were equally significant. The black press in the United States, newspapers like the Pittsburgh Courier and the Chicago Defender, which had been running the WWII campaign since 1942, calling for victory abroad and victory against racism at home, were reporting the achievements of black soldiers in Europe in detail. The contradiction was becoming impossible to sustain. An army that claimed to be fighting for democracy while maintaining a racial caste system within its own ranks. The soldiers who came home after the war came home changed. They had fought alongside men of all backgrounds in the extremities of combat. They had been issued weapons and told their lives depended on their skill with those weapons. They had been trusted with violence on behalf of the nation. And then many of them came home and faced renewed discrimination, denied GI Bill benefits, confronted by systems that refused to recognize what they had earned in uniform. That experience, the profound dissonance between the rhetoric of the war and the reality at home, became one of the driving forces of the civil rights movement that defined the following decades. The legacy from the foxhole to the Oval Office. On July 26, 1948, President Harry Truman signed Executive Order 9981. The language was direct. There shall be equality of treatment and opportunity for all persons in the armed services without regard to race, color, religion, or national origin. With that signature, 170 years of officially sanctioned racial segregation in the United States military was legally abolished. It would take years to fully implement. The Army's last all-black unit was not inactivated until 1954. The Marine Corps dragged its feet. The Navy maintained informal barriers long after official policy changed. Full integration in practice did not arrive until the Korean War forced it through sheer operational necessity. The same force that had always moved the institution, the pressure of a war that needed the best available people in the right positions. But the executive order was the legal foundation, and what led to that executive order was not just political pressure, not just the moral arguments of civil rights leaders, though those were essential. It was also the accumulated weight of battlefield evidence, evidence that had been building since 1944, in the campaign records and after-action reports and performance evaluations of units that had been allowed, in the final months of the war, to operate on the principle of merit rather than race. The data from Patton's Third Army was part of that evidence. The documented performance of the black volunteer infantry platoons was part of that evidence. The 761st Tank Battalion's 183 days of combat were part of that evidence. The soldiers who had been denied promotion and then, when someone finally forced the system to follow its own rules, led their units to success were part of that evidence. Military integration did not happen because someone had a change of heart. It happened because the battlefield kept producing proof that the old system was tactically indefensible. And it happened in part because a general who cared more about winning wars than maintaining comfortable social fictions drove his jeep to a rear echelon office and demanded that the system follow its own rules. General Colin Powell, who became chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff and later the first black Secretary of State, said in 1998 that the military was the only institution in America where a young black man could dream of rising to the highest levels based on merit. He credited Truman's executive order, but the executive order was built on foundations that men in combat had been laying, one firefight at a time, for years before Truman ever picked up his pen. What this story is actually about. There is a temptation to tell this story as a simple triumph. Racism confronted, justice done, the right man in the right place at the right time, with the power and the will to make a difference. And there was a triumph in it, the promotion of black officers who had been systematically denied their earned rank, the documentation of their battlefield performance, the use of that performance as evidence to challenge and ultimately overturn official segregationist policy. These things happened, and they mattered enormously. But the fuller truth is more complicated and ultimately more instructive, because Patton himself was not a crusader for racial equality. He was a product of his era who held many of the prejudices of his era. His biographers note that he genuinely doubted the capabilities of black soldiers in some respects, even as he accepted the 761st into his command, and even as his operational decisions created space for black soldiers to prove those doubts wrong. He moved against the promotion board, not because he had transcended the racial prejudices of his time, but because the tactical inefficiency of the system violated his core values. He could not tolerate waste. He could not tolerate having his best potential leaders sitting in the dirt because some bureaucrat in a heated office had never seen them fight. That is important to understand because it tells you something about how institutional change actually happens. It does not always come from people with the purest motives or the clearest moral vision. Sometimes it comes from people acting on entirely practical grounds who push up against a system so irrational that even their limited perspective can see the problem. The practical argument and the moral argument pointed in the same direction, and when they do, you get movement. The deeper lesson, the one that outlasts the specific battle, is about what institutions do when they prioritize their own comfort over their own stated purpose. The American Army in 1944 said it was fighting for freedom and democracy, and it maintained a rigid racial hierarchy within its own ranks that denied the most basic principle of human equality. The gap between the stated purpose and the actual behavior was immense, and the people who maintained that gap, the men stamping temperament on application files, the generals filing complaints about the disruption to social order, were not fighting for the Army's effectiveness. They were fighting for their own comfort. Systems like that do not reform themselves. They require pressure from outside, from the people the system is failing, from commanders willing to enforce the rules that already exist, from the accumulation of evidence that cannot be argued away. And they require the courage of ordinary people who decided, in whatever way was available to them, to do their job well in circumstances that were designed to prevent them from succeeding. The men who were denied promotions and kept fighting anyway. The men who volunteered for combat infantry when the Bulge was at its worst, leaving their supply unit assignments to pick up rifles and go into the line. The men of the 761st who spent 183 days in combat earning decorations the Army took decades to officially recognize. They were doing more than fighting Germany. They were dismantling a lie, the lie that told the American military, and through it a significant portion of American society, that certain people's service and sacrifice and skill were fundamentally worth less than others. They dismantled that lie not with speeches, but with results, not with petitions, but with performance, not by asking for the respect they were owed, but by making their record impossible to ignore. The world they left behind. The United States military that emerged from the Korean War in the early 1950s was a fundamentally different institution from the one that entered World War II. The last all-black military units were deactivated. Black officers served in integrated commands. The promotion system, however imperfectly and however incompletely, was moving toward genuine merit as its primary criterion. That transformation did not happen in isolation. It interacted with and fed the civil rights movement that reshaped American society over the following decades. When black veterans came home from Korea, from a now legally desegregated military, they came home with a different consciousness about what equality could look like, what it felt like to be judged by performance rather than skin color, and what it was worth fighting for at home. By the time of the Gulf War in 1991, black generals commanded divisions and corps in the United States military. Hispanic admirals led carrier strike groups. Colin Powell, son of Jamaican immigrants, sat as chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, the highest military position in the country, and directed the largest American military operation since Vietnam. Nobody questioned whether these men were qualified. Nobody stamped temperament on their files. The idea that skin color was a relevant factor in military leadership had become, within a single generation, not just officially prohibited, but genuinely indefensible. That world was not built by one battle, one executive order, one confrontation in a Luxembourg city office. It was built by thousands of men and women who showed up and did their jobs with skill and courage in a system that told them they did not belong, who kept building a record that the system eventually could not erase, who held the line until the line finally moved, and it was built, in part, by the commanders who were willing to enforce the principles the Army already claimed to hold, who looked at the evidence in front of them and refused to let the institution hide from its own data. George Patton died in December 1945, just months after the war ended, from injuries sustained in a car accident in occupied Germany. He was buried in Luxembourg, in the cemetery where the men of his Third Army who fell in the Battle of the Bulge are laid to rest, because that is where he asked to be with the soldiers he commanded. He left no clean legacy. He was difficult, controversial, and held views that we would rightly condemn today. But in the winter of 1944 and 1945, he did something that mattered. He looked at the system he commanded and refused to let it waste the men it needed. He looked at the evidence and followed where it led. He made the institution follow its own rules when it had been comfortable ignoring them. That is not everything, but it is something. And in January 1945, in the middle of the bloodiest battle the American Army ever fought, it was enough to change the trajectory of an institution, and through that institution of a nation, because the most dangerous enemy is not always across the battlefield. Sometimes it is behind the desk, and sometimes the most important fight is the one you have to pick with your own side. If you found this story valuable, please consider subscribing to World War II Tales. For more stories like this, the ones that happen behind the headlines, inside the institutions, among the men and women whose names do not always make it into the history books, but whose actions shaped the world we inherited, share this video if it meant something to you. And leave a comment below telling us which aspect of this story hit hardest. We will see you next time.